So I'm going to start with some of the journalism that's been done on the MSF Kunduz hospital bombing. From day one, Doctors Without Borders has stated that it was a quiet night. No Taliban activity was witnessed or reported. No one was armed in the hospital facility. Only patients and medical staff were there with the gates locked. And when you actually look at the compound, it's about 2 football fields in size, surrounded by fields. But in the over hour-long aerial strike, only the hospital's facility took consistent bombing. GPS coordinates were also regularly provided to both the US and Afghan, both military and civilian officials, up to 8 days before the bombing occurred. Doctors Without Borders also received no warning whatsoever that the bombing was going to happen. None of these statements are in so many articles that the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News have been putting out in consultation with legal experts and whatnot. And the US story has changed now, I think, 4 or 5 times. First, they tried to brush it off as collateral damage. When MSF and the world did not stand for that, they stated that, it was the Afghans who called it in. Afghani officials tried to say that Doctors Without Borders was a safe haven for the Taliban, which has been denied incessantly by Doctors Without Borders. People were saying that perhaps, with Taliban activity, the hospital would lose its protected status. But recently, the New York Times came out with an article with the U.S. saying that it didn't lose its protected status whatsoever. For the witness statements of Doctors Without Borders to actually be taken into account, it's quite clear that there has to be an independent investigation. So supporting the troops probably wasn't expected to be on this list, because usually when you criticize war, you're seen as not supporting the troops at all. But what better way to actually support and protect the troops than holding officials accountable who their lives are pretty much at the mercy of? Take into account how much journalism is actually withheld from soldiers on military bases. From The Intercept, The Guardian, WikiLeaks, the independent journalism and whistleblowing that has actually shown the ramifications of the military's actions, whether it be actual civilian casualties or the continuation of torture. Soldiers are pretty much left in the dark. Combine that with what's very much so underplayed in the United States, and that's the amount of veteran suicide that occurs every single day. It's estimated 22 veterans a day take their lives, many suffering from what's known as moral injury, different from what's publicly known as PTSD, because it's not only what you've witnessed that has such an effect, but what you've done. Many soldiers only understanding the ramifications and that breaking of conscience happening after the fact. So when you demand an independent investigation, you're helping protect not only the safety of troops, but also the mental health, and making sure that they are not receiving criminal orders. So when it comes to radicalization against the United States, the first thing that the American public was told was that they hate us for our freedom. Now, what's more popular is saying that it's an extremist Islamic belief. What goes very much so underplayed is how much radicalization and recruitment is done based on U.S. policy and military actions that have been going on for over a decade. Drone strikes, the continuation of torture in black sites, still open Guantanamo, where people are starving themselves in protests or being kept in prison after being cleared innocent for over a decade. In reading the recent drone papers that The Intercept released, you can clearly see that in Afghanistan, in a 5-month period of drone strikes, there was 30 some odd targets with over 200 people dying who were not targets at all. 90% of the casualties were not targets at all. Also, the source of the drone papers, a veteran whistleblower, stated that we're not targeting people in drone strikes, we're targeting SIM cards. And after months of thinking that you got a high-valued target, it turns out they were using their mother's phone. Amnesty International's report years ago on drones, a case study was done on a grandmother who was in a field alone picking okra, and she was taken out in a drone strike. Perhaps that was one of those times. Those cases are more radicalizing than a cartoon or a McDonald's. So in having an independent investigation, it shows the world that the U.S. doesn't believe in bombing with impunity, that hospitals are a sacred space, and that civilian life in foreign areas has value. So when it comes to the future of war, what's on the horizon of drones is autonomous weaponry. There is literally a campaign called Stop Killer Robot. I am talking about that step further from drones where there is no driver, where targets are stricken based on algorithms and programs. Now, I'm not saying sentinels are coming, but it's actually exactly what I'm saying. So with that on the horizon, it probably would be best to have an international humanitarian fact-finding commission activated. So when it comes to prosecuting powerful countries like the US for war crimes, there's a lot of cynicism. People are like, well, what can we really do? What can happen? But MSF has actually provided an answer. And that's with the activation of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. This is a commission that was specifically designed to host independent investigations so that countries that were suspected of war crimes wouldn't just investigate themselves. It was under the Geneva Conventions, which the US is beholden to, created in the 1970s, but never activated before. When you look into the future and see growing effects of climate change, civil unrest, these endless wars that seem to have no bounds, there is an opportunity to actually evolve our international law standards, should we not take it? So when it comes to whether or not this was a war crime, I'm just going to read to you the summary of international law that MSF has provided. A targeted attack on a medical facility is a violation of international humanitarian law and can constitute a war crime if it was A, intentional, B, due to negligence stemming from a failure to properly verify the military or civilian nature of the target, C, a disproportionate response to the identified military threat, or D, undertaken without advance warning of an imminent attack. So A, was it intentional? Well, again, from day one, MSF has stated that out of a 2 football field-sized compound, the hospital facility was the only target that got consistent bombing for over an hour. B, dealing with negligence. Even though the U.S. has claimed that it was a mistake, that's not a sufficient answer to the war crime of bombing a hospital. Again, the GPS coordinates for that hospital was regularly provided, and there seemed to have been a failure to verify. C, dealing with a disproportionate response. Even if there was a Taliban official with a gun inside the hospital, it is a disproportionate response to bomb that entire hospital for over an hour. And of course, D, undertaken with no advance warning of an imminent attack. There was no warning provided to MSF. So with all of this precedent and justification for MSF's call for an independent investigation, I would ask you, if not now, when? If the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission was ever going to be activated, what else would have to happen other than something like this? It is time that we stop looking forward, we don't just look backward, and look at the very present. And this video was not just meant to make commentary, it was also to consolidate as many resources and articles as possible, which you can check out in the description. And most importantly, the link at the top is the official MSF change.org petition for an independent investigation, which I urge you to sign. Thanks.